Morning, everyone. Just one more minute and then we'll get started. Thank you. Okay, I think in the interest of time, we can get started with the session while other participants connect. So just to start, welcome officially to day 4 of GCA Masterclass on climate resilient PPPs. We started this week talking about the opportunity to integrate resilience into PPPs. On day 2, we started to see how to assess climate risks to infrastructure and plan investments under uncertain climate conditions. On day 3, we were discussing what are key financing mechanisms for resilient infrastructure and also how we can integrate nature-based solutions as part of resilience options of PPP projects. Today, we are going to continue the sessions with 2 other very important topics, which are tender and performance requirements for infrastructure, as well as stakeholder engagement for resilient PPPs. You have been seeing in these discussions, you have been very active in these discussions, and I hope that you are also today in this session. This just to explain a bit about the structure. I will be acting today actually as your moderator. You have been seeing David so far in this role, but today he will actually share a little bit more of his knowledge and expertise in the topic and also present a session. So therefore, we are going to share this role for today. But to start the session, I would like to introduce the first speaker of the day, and that is Jean-Christophe Barth, from the Executive Director of the World Association of PPP Units and Practitioners. Jean-Christophe has been leading several discussions on these links between climate change, resilience, adaptation, and PPPs, sustainable development and PPPs. Including this year, he has even published a report on how to make PPPs fit the 2030 agenda. He will share some of his insights with us today, and I hope that you enjoyed the session. Jean-Christophe, the floor is yours. I think you're on mute.
Thank you for the kind introduction. And today I will speak to you on tender requirements and performance metrics for resilient PPPs. I think it's most useful for all of us that I speak about the topics that I find the most crucial, because in such a long-term contract relationship, many things can happen. And so it's important that we factor in the correct elements and that we make it as resilient also from a, say, contract managerial and claim avoidance perspective. Next slide, please. So who am I? I'm the Executive Director of the World Association of PPP Units and Professionals. It's a little organization, an NGO in Geneva, that has started in 2018 to create a global network of PPP practitioners. And I will speak more on that at the end of my presentation. I have a background as an international mediator, and my training is in banking and in law. And I've also done an executive MBA a couple of years later. Essentially, I've worked on large infrastructure projects in the rolling stock industry, where I had to manage complicated, contracts of huge values. Sometimes you lose the relation because it's just millions and billions, but the problems are recurring, and it's always the same difficulty of making public sector and private sector work together to deliver value and not just to propose value. Next slide, please. So this is the agenda I propose for today. We'll establish a couple of golden rules, how we want to stay engaged during this quality time we have together this morning. Then we'll talk about the win-win-win framing of a people-first public-private partnership. We'll look at the project design phases from a socio-technical perspective. Then I'll share with you a couple of innovative approaches for contract redesign so we can have better business and avoid difficulties. I'll also give you an example on how complex contracts can be visualized on just one page to reduce complexity and to make sure that everybody it sticks to the same agenda. Then we'll also look at what needs to happen to design inclusive and resilient contracts, because our topic is, performance requirements and how can you factor these things in. Then I'll do a little excursion on the EU taxonomy that is coming up. We'll also talk about the steps of conflict escalation and how collaboration can actually, or dispute avoidance can create more collaborative public-private partnerships. And then we'll also look at, the new rules of communication. And I'll give you a couple of hints for additional resources and then a short presentation on WAPPP. Next slide, please. So I'd like this masterclass to be as interactive and lively and interesting for you as possible. So please keep your video on at all times so we can see each other. You can, come in at any time in the chat to ask a question, and I'll decide if I can take it in directly or at the end of the presentation. The workshop is solely for educational purposes. If I show any kind of practical examples from my experience, this is only for educational purposes. Thank you. Next slide. So if we talk about people first, public-private partnership, there's one important paradigm that everybody needs to understand. We're not in a simple public-private relationship. We're in a situation where we have civil society, beneficiaries of that infrastructure, who are also to be, considered. And we want the infrastructure, be it physical or social infrastructure, to be as SDG driven and resilient as possible. How do we do that? Usually, countries come up, or country coordinators, like if you do an UN speak, have a general interest of pushing certain political agendas, but there's always also a country vision, and this needs to be constantly, that there are feedback loops also with the population in the best case. And you do that because you want to create positive externalities that then shape the climate resilient outcome. And it's very important to prepare that and to make sure that these vision and positive externalities actually get broken down in the process of procuring infrastructure, because we're talking about very, very long project life cycles. And I'll have a slide for you just to look at the different phases on how these public tenders, these large, procurement operations and programs can be broken down. We have the three interdependent dimensions, sustainable environment, sustainable, society and economy that all interact with each other. And we need to make sure that they can all, in Germany you say die Entfaltung, so they can all develop and flourish to the best extent, and that without compromising the future taxpayers' money. And on a general base, and I'm sure you're aware with that we distinguish two big classes of public-private partnership. There are those that are government paid models, and there's the user paid model, which is also called the concession model. Next slide, please. So if we look at it from a project design phase approach, we start with the white book phase, which is where you identify what type of infrastructure is needed. We want it to be a viable public-private partnership that articulates clear environmental and social resilience benchmarks. Even achieving that is a challenge of its own. It requires, surveys. You have to make sure that the future needs also will be met through the infrastructure. And this is quite a challenging process and procedure. Then we come to the blue book phase, which is when you have identified what you want to have, you have designed the bid, and you receive the submissions. You are in the award phase. You have to select the best bidder and negotiate the contract. And what is important there is that all the objectives that you have set out are actually broken down into binding commitments in the contract, because you need to be able to fulfill these, specs and the requirement catalog that has been set out. And this is important in order to evaluate and to create the framework and the conditions for a proper due diligence for the financial closing. Obviously, during the blue book phase, communication is reduced to the stakeholders that are still part of the bid or procurement process, if you may. And there are a couple of legal limitations in that phase, and that stems from the fact that you don't want to falsify the game of competition. You need, to a certain extent, to protect the competition law aspect, because if somebody then says, "Oh, I want to do some hard selling," then it doesn't advance anyone, and this would falsify then the whole tender process, and this needs to be avoided also. Obviously, there are informations that only come in after certain deadlines and that cannot be factored in anymore, but it's a really relevant procedure. Then we look at the orange book phase. Orange book phase is after NTP, so after the notice to proceed, when the parties have gotten the sign off to build the infrastructure projects, be it a new railroad station or some hospital project or an airport project. I mean, you name it. Many different asset classes can all be taken for that. There, you need to make sure that there is, a process where you can follow up with what has been agreed on formally and how it is lived. And often, and that is from my experience, it's very difficult to cope with changes, be they planned or unexpected, because you add friction points. And this can lead to complicated discussions. And we'll speak later about what happens in that situation from a, say, emotional standpoint also, and from a dispute resolution angle. It's important to build a contract framework that is as resilient as possible, that allows the parties to overcome any kind of difficulties and complicated issues from a commercial contract standpoint, so that no one loses face and they can proceed with the construction of the project, because nobody is really helped if the project is interrupted. It creates a huge backlog in problems, which then makes the conversation and proceeding with the program even more difficult. So it's important to build the right mechanism in terms of project governance, that the parties are still able to work towards making progress and are not held up with things that can impact seriously the continuation of the project. And then we move to the maintenance and service level agreement phase, where we have this long-term support that needs to be ensured for the concession, and where we need to maintain continuity of quality service. But we need to also factor in these resilience elements and regenerative aspects, because there is technical progress. digitization will open opportunities we don't know today at the moment of contract signature or during the project execution, and that may impact the project in 12, maybe 20 years from today. And what we want to make sure is that the infrastructure that is being designed and built is that it's, you know, expandable, that it's renewable, regenerative, and that we can, you know, apply innovative techniques and solutions, artificial intelligence, or other things that are more environmental friendly, allowing progress to be made, to be able to factor that in. And for this to happen, it's essential, and that's the bar that goes over the whole screen, ongoing communication between stakeholders, especially with civil society, the users and beneficiaries. A lot of time, this last aspect, engaging civil society, the users, the prospective beneficiaries, is not done properly in projects. And it needs to be, because only then can we really speak of a tripartite contract relationship, which it is. And it's difficult to find the right representative on the civil society side, because we know it's no company, it doesn't have, you know, a representative as such, but it's worth the effort, because experience shows that if it is possible to include, you know, like that gender dimension also, we are able to build better infrastructure. We're able to deliver something that meets the requirements of the users. And it takes an extra effort, and it may take more time, but the results are superior. Next slide, please. So when we talk about contract redesign for better business and problem prevention, there's actually a discipline on that. And it's called the UX of contracts, so user experience of contracts. What you want to do there is to avoid, you know, complexities and unnecessary risk by visualizing and simplifying the contract. I'll show you an example afterwards how that can be done. And the lessons learned from that, and this is empirically proven, is that if you have a maximum of visualization, more multi-competence teams can work with it, and not just the lawyers who have drafted it for, you know, other lawyers, or even worse, the judge, because then it's a self-fulfilling prophecy and you really end up in front of the judge, which you want to avoid. So visualizing these things is important. It brings better results because people understand it faster, and the answers in interpretation are more correct than they would be if there were no such visualization. If you want more resources on this, you can click on the link then. Next slide, please. So this is an example on how a complex project can be visualized, and this can be done with any kind of, you know, infrastructure contract. You can please next. You can see different things like the delivery. You can have the preliminary handover, the final handover. You can see all the payment milestones, the warranty timelines, like a grace period before final handover. You can see also when the performance bonds need to be put down, the parent company guarantee. A lot of these things that are necessary for the homologation of an infrastructure to be acceptable. And it requires a bit of creativity, but having such a document is really helpful for anyone to understand in which design phase the project is, and it'll help cross-functionally between, you know, there's a lot of people involved in these large infrastructure projects, be it people for quality assurance, quantity surveyors, the engineer themselves, the architects, the lawyers, the, you know, there's so many people involved, and they can all refer to the same document. They may not be familiar with legalistic text, which may be construed differently. But if you have something where you visualize, this prevents a lot of misunderstandings. Next. So if we want to design inclusive and resilient contracts, it's important to reflect that integrative partnership. We need to have common objectives. It takes time to work on them and to clarify them, but if everybody is aligned who has to realize that project, then we can have superior results. What is important to me in that context is that we really have a close look at the Sustainable Development Goals and the sub-goals, 169 sub-goals, and then there are targets underneath these. For example, I mean, 17.1 is public-private partnerships. The sole custodian of 17.1 is the World Bank Group. World Bank Group is looking at how many US dollars are being spent every year on physical infrastructure. What we need to have too is how do we actually measure social infrastructure? For that, they don't have metrics yet, which is a pity, but we'll come to that in a minute because we have the beginning of having a bit of more mandatory information sharing that is coming with the new EU taxonomy. Next, please. So this is it. This is the first time that I have heard of that it's going to be mandatory from January 1st, 2022 to disclose non-financial reporting. That means if you have an undertaking, and undertakings in that sense are financial intermediaries with at least 500 employees, it will become mandatory for them to disclose information on where do they do investments. This is to make sure that the EU climate and energy targets for 2030 and the objectives of the Green Deal be reached. And for that, we need information. And today, the information is not readily available. And so the overall objective of the EU taxonomy, it's like a dictionary that says, okay, this is a sustainable investment that has been done, is to redirect and to enhance the capital flows towards environmentally sustainable projects and activities. Now, this will not prevent the undertakings, to stay in that jargon, to continue investing in maybe non-sustainable assets, but it will create an effect that it will de facto create, an expectation that they do investments in classes that are sustainable. And the undertakings, just to be clear, that's large listed companies, banks, and insurances. And I've told you that's at more than 500 employees. For that, they will employ, next slide, please. They will apply 4 tests. It's what is on the right side here, which they need to contribute substantially to at least one of the environmental objectives to satisfy these environmental sustainable activities. They have to do no significant harm to any of the other environmental objectives. They need to be carried out in compliance with minimum social and governance safeguards, and to comply with technical screening criteria, so-called TSC, to be adopted under the regulation. So this is new land. It's not even, it's been decided, but it's only going to kick in January next year. And so how do I believe it will influence the new European taxonomy regulation, at least indirectly? I think that the EU-wide framework targets institutional investors and asset managers like funds, portfolio management, insurance-based investment products, and pension schemes. And those are typically the ones who invest in infrastructure. Because it's long-term, it brings stable revenues, you name it. And so the EU taxonomy will have a soft law normative effect also beyond Europe, as it's the largest economy worldwide as a bloc. And if you want, it's sort of a trendsetter in that space. I believe that the users of infrastructure, they will very likely have a strong lever in whether certain economic activities meet their expectations towards environmentally sustainable economic activities. Because if it is not an economically sustainable activity, sustainable economic activity, let's put it that way, then people will not invest in these classes anymore, and this obviously will create negative incentives for those who are not sustainable. And this might create situations where PPPs, infrastructure that are sustainable, will become the norm, and those that don't comply will not be able to receive adequate funding. So the second phase then of the EU taxonomy that will be setting rules on environmental sustainability objectives, and will then extend to social objectives. And we've talked to them on the previous slide. Can you go back just a second? Which are underneath here from January 2023, they will have to deliver information regarding their contribution to water, circular economy, pollution control, and biodiversity. Next, please. Next. Okay, now we turn to the dispute avoidance side. You know, famous principle, an eye for an eye only ends up making the whole world blind. I think he's very right about that, Mahatma Gandhi. Next slide, please. So if we look at the conflict dynamics, typically it starts on the left side, on the top left corner, with the hardening of positions. Then the debate polarizes. At some point, there'll be a breakdown of communication. People don't use words anymore, but they use actions, and actions that can hurt. This is a race to the bottom, and it ends at, together into the abyss. Both sides risk losing everything because they're not able to find solutions together. And at that point, at latest, help is needed. Next slide, please. So what can we do for that? Well, first is we need to build in a good partnering culture in the public-private partnership for resilient infrastructure. We need to make sure that it's a joint point of collaboration in the culture. This is something that needs to be honed constantly. Next, we have the dimension of visualization. We talked about that already. That makes sure that the project can be executed smoothly. And then there's one thing that is very common in large infrastructure projects, and that's installing a standing dispute board. And that is a multi-competence expert panel that is reviewing the project from all angles where there are difficulties of interpretation throughout, the design, the commissioning, and the operation phase. Another way to address dispute avoidance and resolution is before going, for example, for a costly arbitration, try to do a co-mediation. Or ideally one mediator. If it's not possible, every side can take its co-mediator, and you can have a multi-party co-mediation. There are different variants to that. One is called the mediation at last offer arbitration, which combines the advantages of having a binding decision, but also having a self-determined decision. And arbitration, the classical, where you have a final settlement of a dispute by a third party. Next, please. So sometimes communication can go wrong. Next, please. We know that today, most of the communication is being done virtually, and that leads to difficulties. And there's been a recent study I found in May 2021 by Questor. The Digital Telecommunication Trust found that from 2,000 office workers, over 70% experienced some form of unclear communication from their colleagues. And this must not be like that. Poor or confusing digital communication adds up to an average annual amount of $188 billion wasted across alone the American economy. So what's important is that we show emotional intelligence in the projects that we accompany and execute. We need to read carefully, and that is the new listening. If we receive digital messages through Slack, through email, you name it. Writing clearly is the new empathy, and a phone call is worth more than 1,000 words. So I'm wrapping up. I'm coming to the end of my presentation. Next slide, please. I've given you a couple of additional resources if you want to deep dive into contract conditions for resilient PPPs and how to negotiate them with success. We've run a webinar earlier this year, and another one on how dispute avoidance creates more collaborative PPPs together with the Dispute Resolution Board Foundation. Next slide, please. And also you will find the GI Hub risk allocation tool from 2019 and the new SDG impact assessment tool that the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe has developed. Next, please. And now, if you're interested, but first we'll open up the question, I can present a bit to you what WAPPP is doing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jean-Christophe, for a very interesting presentation. I think you were able to touch upon some very important discussions here. And I think to start discussions, I would like to see if anyone has a specific question. And I saw in the chat that you said had a more, let's say, technical question in terms of some of the terms used. So perhaps Lisette would like to unmute yourself and pose the question, please.
Yeah, it's not too relevant. I was just wondering if there was a link between the Fittig colors and the names you mentioned before.
No, there is no link.
Okay,
maybe for those who are not familiar with Fittig Rules. So Fittig is the Federation of International Engineers. They have their seat here in Geneva, just 400 meters from my house here. And it's at the airport, and they have a huge network and have actually tried to create a systematic of different contracts. And so there's the red book, the gold book, depending on if it's a turnkey project or if it's a engineering, procurement, etc. type of project. So there's like silver book, and so different colors. But the color code that I used is more of project management talk: white book, blue book, orange book. This is not corresponding to the Fittig terminology at all.
Okay, thank you. While I'm unmuted, I have a question or a remark on. I really like the visualization of this 200-page contract in just one page. Do you have experience already with that? Do you really have some of them in contracts, and what is the response?
It's overwhelmingly positively received, because from what I have seen, a lot of times I have to overcome the prejudice. Oh, here comes the contract manager. This is Mr. Know-it-all in terms of contracts. But I'm not even going to bother reading that. I know what I have to do, and I look at the technical requirement catalog and not at the contract. And then you very quickly come into a situation where you have a gap, and it can very quickly become a big gap, especially if the change order process has not been defined properly. And I would even recommend to be very, very clear on the change management process. Every time you need to adapt the contract, it needs to be crystal clear how to proceed. And a lot of times it's very surprising, even with very mature people that do it, there is an execution risk at that level. So yeah, absolutely try to visualize to the max, because it helps multi-competence teams, and that's usually the context in which we operate and work. You know, on the technical space, we work in multi-competence teams, and so we need to be able to talk to all the people with all that different, professional deformations, so that they can understand and relate to that. And it's easier if you draw it for them. I use it a lot in mediation when I gather facts from the parties. I take a board behind me and I try to visualize it. And hey, they say, oh, that's right. I haven't seen it like that. Yeah. And if there is a discrepancy, then you can correct it and say, the engineer, I don't agree with you. I'm right, you're wrong. And say, okay, your understanding is you see it that way, but can you explain why? And then you can drill down to the bottom. And the less open points you have, the less risky it is. And I think it's particularly important to apply this scrutiny when we talk about SDG implementation, about climate resilient goals. What is this? People describe it as rather soft criteria, but how can we make it hard? So hard like a rock, so that the contractor does not have a way to get out of this, so that they make it their own, because they are also convinced by the overall objective. And this is the challenge.
Thank you for that, Jean-Christophe. I saw that Samir also sent a question in the chat. Samir, perhaps would you like to unmute yourself and ask the question directly?
Sure, thank you. I'm Samir Pete from CDRI, Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. My question was basically relating to countries which don't have very well developed capacity in the government to handle PPPs. So what are some considerations that you take into account when you're working in such contexts?
So first thing, for a national PPP unit that doesn't have the capacity for that, is to link up with WAPPP. WAPPP is there for that. I mean, we're a for impact organization, a non-profit that simply brings together the PPP units of the world so that they can meet other professionals that may have been exposed to similar situations, and then we can connect them to other people. And often the first level peer-to-peer exchanges are very rich and helps them to understand, hey, I'm not by my own, I'm not yeah, there are other people there. And looking beyond your plate and your technical field of expertise, which is public-private partnership, is rich. And so this is our value proposition. Currently it's a complete volunteer initiative. We would hope to be able to do that more seriously once we have more resources, but currently that's the way we operate. And it's extremely fulfilling, I can tell you.
Thank you for that, Jean-Christophe and Samir. I also saw that America had a question in the chat. Perhaps America would like to unmute yourself and also ask the question.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation. For this new taxonomy regulations that has to be filled in 2022, are you taking some considerations for that? Are you really preparing for that? And for example, this one that do not harm to any other environmental objectives, which considerations are you taking with that one?
So when I prepared this, I looked at your brand new operator's handbook, which is fantastic. And then I told myself, hey, how does this work with the EU taxonomy? I wasn't able to find anything on that. So it's like, maybe I can bring something on that. So here is the impact. You can't see it because I have the virtual background. Just a second, I'll take it away. Tack, tack. So here you have the Commission Impact Assessment Report, where it says what are the outcomes that are expected with this new framework. And you have to imagine it like a dictionary, a big dictionary for all investors. What is a sustainably acceptable economic activity? And it won't go as far as not allowing to invest in these categories. It'll simply say, this is sustainable activities. But the funny effect is that by defining it as this is a sustainable economic activity, it actually creates an incentive. And so rather than having something that you don't go there, everybody wants to go there, you actually do it the opposite way, and you educate people with a positive incentive and say, those of you undertakings that have more than 500 employees and that do their investments in sustainable activities will be able to report that they have done so. And those that don't, they can continue to do it, but it'll probably create a situation where people want to go to be with clean hands. this is what I have seen, and I haven't seen it yet applied to the context of public-private partnership. So it's a bit of a, innovation, if you want. I imagine that there is a lot of infrastructure investment and that it's going to become relevant, but it's not on the radar so far.
Thank you for that, Jean-Christophe and America. I saw that there are a couple more questions in the chat, but in the interest of time, and so we can go to the next presentation, I will keep those questions saved so we can also ask at the open discussions in the end. So thank you again, Jean-Christophe. And I would like now to give the floor to David Baxter. David, I mean, you have met David before. He was from the opening ceremony and moderating the sessions before. But David is a senior PPP advisor at the International Sustainable Resilience Center and actually also member of the steering committee of the World Association of PPP Units and Practitioners. David today will be talking about stakeholder engagement and how that can help to enhance the resilience of PPPs. So without any further ado, David, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you, JC. Some of the comments you made, I think, are very relevant for what I'm going to be talking about, especially on the idea of conflict escalation and avoiding it. In my presentation, I'll be referring to the general aspects that have been introduced on stakeholder engagement in the handbook, and then I will be looking at an example. I'm a very practical person, and I'm going to be talking about a major PPP project where I live, which has gone wrong, and why it went wrong and the challenges and things that can happen. So as we know, I think no one's a novice to this, that PPPs are long-term contract between a private party and a government entity. And there's, for providing a service on asset, and there's risk which is shared, and there's also management responsibility, and performance is remunerated if you do well. And this is a complex relationship between the two parties. We have a situation where, gosh, I think I've undone my screen shares. You still can see my screen share?
Yes, we can, but not on the full screen.
Okay, there we are. Thank you.
Great.
So one of the big challenges then is, these partnerships. I mean, I always stress over and over again that a public-private partnership is a partnership. If there aren't partnerships, to me, it's not a PPP. And this involves, building a tremendous amount of trust between all the stakeholders that are involved. And there are different types of stakeholders, what are referred to as primary and secondary stakeholders, or you can call them internal and external audiences. And, basically stakeholders, the broad description of them, experience project risk and also experience outcomes differently. And therefore, this requires a very effective communication. You get the partners, these are the contractual partners, and in a way they are stakeholders as well, but it's slightly a different group. When we're talking about discussions, we want to have an ongoing discussion between all parties that are involved. And so it's important that during the stakeholder engagement, we look at the benefits that can exist. These were highlighted in the handbook, but it's an opportunity for communication with stakeholders to provide more detailed information and innovation. There are new ideas being exchanged all the time, and these need to be shared, but they need to be understood as well. There's also, if stakeholders are involved, you can ask them about, what are the resilience options and how can you prioritize them? And then we can also help how the project will deliver value to society. Numerous discussions in the last few days have talked about the community, that PPP projects, when we're talking about climate, are not in isolation of a community, but they are a part of a community. And unless we engage stakeholders and we communicate with them, we're not engaging the community. And it's also, in this way that if we have these communications, we have a chance to risk, how would you call it? Or to avoid risk, and we can better understand interdependencies because there are them, the commonalities that exist, and the trade-offs. In a true stakeholder discussion and engagement, it's not a win-win situation. I mean, it's not a lose-lose situation, as JC mentioned. We're looking for win-win situations, and this often requires trade-offs. The stakeholders, there's a very, very wide range and description of stakeholders. You can see on the right-hand side, when we're looking specifically at climate resilience in projects, there's a whole range of them. But also if we're looking specifically at PPPs, there are specific stakeholders as well. So it's important that we find a balance. And so we want to identify the stakeholders. We want to understand how they are going to be influenced or impacted by the project, how they can influence the project as well is important. And they include the public and the private sector, as you can see there. Civil society is really important, especially in emerging economies where often communities are ignored. NGOs are also involved. And it's just important to note that stakeholders, although they are stakeholders in the project, when it gets to the contractual element, it's different to the role that partners, the actual PPP partners have. And it's important to take that into notice. And therefore, it is important to have a very fine balance between the two. On this table, this is information that is found in the report. Or in the handbook, sorry, I just try to identify some of the specific roles. Everything is specific for each stakeholder, but it's also cumulative and collaborative. And we cannot separate them. And I should have done a little circle in the middle of that, showing that all these partners, stakeholders, however you want to describe them, end users, are interrelated and have a role to engage with one another. The public partner obviously is executing the procurement, and they also have to, support the integration. The private partner is responsible for implementing the project. So there's a duality here of, what do we mean by when the public party is saying we are implementing, and understanding what is the private party saying when we're implementing. Lenders are an important stakeholder. And what we have to do is help them change their mindset around what constitutes value to encourage their investment. We had a number of speakers in the last few days that also talked about green bonds, the responsibilities, the changes, the actions that are involved in this. And in the end users, I'm often amazed when we look at the partners in projects and we have end users that can be ignored. And there have been situations where PPP projects have fallen apart because end users were not consulted, not kept informed, and these end users are part of that stakeholder community. What comes to mind just about a year or two ago was when the new toll road was created between Albania and Kosovo. And I think on the second or third day of the PPP, the toll gates were burned down by crowds of people who were very upset that they suddenly had to pay to use a facility which they'd actually been using for a while before the toll gates were brought into situation. So communication is important. It's cumulative. They're part of the community, part of the stakeholder, and we need to be collaborative. In the handbook, there's a very, very good diagram that also shows, there's different stakeholder roles. And you can see here, for example, during the project identification phase, this is where it starts. You don't start it on phase 2 or 3 or 4. You need to start it right up front. But the public partner is responsible for identifying and screening projects, but they should also be doing this in conjunction with the end users. There's the project appraisal phase. Again, end users will be involved. The tender award, this is where the private partner is introduced. But one thing I want to say that, if you've done effective market outreach to stakeholders and different parties are informed about the project coming up, the private partners would have a greater understanding of the project when they bid for it. We also have, the contract management phase, which is critical. And this is a lot of what JC talked about earlier on, but I would say hand-holding, communicating, looking for solutions, avoiding conflict, and this is critically important. You do need a clear stakeholder engagement plan. And many times, I think that many projects, almost all of them that I've worked on, there isn't a very clear stakeholder engagement plan. And so, we can share these in different phases. We can come up with different specific actions. But, for example, in the tender and award phase, identifying evaluation criteria is critically important. How can you launch a project? How can you even run a project if you don't know what the evaluation criteria are? This is one of the, the fundamental basics. And if the evaluation criteria aren't there, the terms of reference are going to be very unclear, and this is going to result in conflict. And the most important thing in the contract management phase, again, is dispute resolution. So we need a stakeholder communication, as I said, plan with different elements that are introduced. You can see here the diagram also from the manual. but you know, they talk about, we have a communication strategy network or framework, sorry, that needs to ask the questions of why, who, what, how, and when. If you don't ask those questions, you are, I think, going to be crippling your project in the long run. So we need a strategic approach, and that means not something that you're creating on the fly or on the go, but you're actually working on it from the beginning. The challenge with projects is poor communication can lead to false rumors or false messages or false expectations or false statements. Unfortunately, there are action groups often that are against a project, be it for good or bad. But if the communication is bad in that area, you'll find that this leads to a breakdown in messaging, and the result can be disastrous for the project. And you'll see an example that I'm looking at. Communication needs to be coordinated very carefully. And the one word that I want to emphasize is transparency. If you exclude even one group of stakeholders from relevant information that should be shared with all parties, you are creating a situation where transparency suffers and where parties would feel that they are being left out of the discussion. It's also important, if you have these good communications, it can prevent delays in project implementation. And you'll see an example how bad communication led to major delays. And then it's also evidence that the government is committed to the project if they're sharing their ideas. You don't want a politician to say 3 years into a project that we didn't really support it. We were forced into this. And then also, if you have effective communication, you can respond to queries. Stakeholders will have questions and they will ask things, and we need to ensure that they are given a voice. So I'm going to talk briefly about a very, very controversial project in my region. I live in Virginia in the United States, and in the next state, there's the state of Maryland. I don't know if you know the geography of the region, but between the two states, there's Washington, D.C., the federal triangle, as they call it, the federal zone. But one of the big challenges that we face in this region is a tremendous amount of traffic. Just to go 10 miles in the morning to get to the city center from where I live can take up to an hour and a half when there's congestion. So this project was devised to link the different metro lines that exist and to sort of create an arc of communication above, so that you didn't have to use a spoke system, but you could actually use a spoke and wheel system for transportation. There were environmental benefits that were discussed. It was estimated it would take thousands of cars off the road. It would use electrical power that would then just cut down in pollution, and also efforts were made to look at using existing right-of-ways, so almost sort of a brownfield approach, so that it would be less disruption. And it was described as an environmentally viable project. This project was 16.2 miles long, a 36-year PPP project, which is quite a long period of time. And the completion of the first phase was set for 2022, which is next year. There'd be 21 stations that would connect the metro, the metropolitan metro system. And one of the selling points was that it'd be an economic contributor to Montgomery and Prince George counties with where it laid. And it did enjoy considerable political support. The reason it was done as a PPP, and you've heard this before, basically there was a funding gap. There was a shortage of public funds. It was also decided to engage the private sector because they offered to provide innovation and delivery on time, which is always important with projects. However, as the project started materializing and people saw where it was going, you have in the United States often, sort of not in my backyard, or the NIMBY effect, and people started looking and thinking, wow, this is going to impact my neighborhood. There are a lot of very sensitive streams in the area, water courses, and there was concern about it. And eventually there were two stakeholder camps that evolved, one that really supported it and one group that was against it for environmental concerns. There was a competitive procurement that was awarded. And remember, if you know the structure of PPPs in the special purpose vehicle or the project company, there's the sort of the EPC contractor group, and then there's the financing group. And the EPC group was called PLTC, and it consisted of large, well-known companies, Flora Lane, and then the Taylor Brothers, and then the investors, and the group that invested, not to be confused, but they also had an acronym PLTP, which included organizations even such as Meridian, which is well-known internationally. soon things started falling apart a little bit. There were challenges. First of all, there was a suspicion that the financial risk may have been, or financial risk might have been overtaken or over-absorbed, let's call it, by the state. And we'll see that this kind of did point out to be true. There was also, because of political pressure and the rush to get it done and to get the best price, that maybe some people felt that it was a low bid. There were project delays due to environmental challenges. Early on, the stakeholders felt, and these were not project partners, but stakeholders felt that there were great challenges and that they were being ignored. Construction costs overran because of legal challenges, everything that JC warned us against. There was also serious disagreements between PLTC, this was the EPC contractor, and essentially they said, you know, if we don't reach an agreement and this escalated, we're going to get to a situation where we are going to say that, we can exercise our right to exit the project if certain things happen. So legal challenges occurred. There was a tremendous amount of litigation, and the end result of it, which is mind-boggling for a project the size and that it even reached this, is that there was basically a 2.5-year delay, which, you know, I just wonder where JC was talking about the SLC, how this even happened, and then added costs of over $519 million, which is unbelievable. I mean, there are many projects in the world of this extent that don't even cost $519 million. In the end, we saw things start falling apart. There were 976 days delay. I mean, that's nearly 3 years. The project company stated it couldn't meet its agreements every time it communicated with the public sector that things were falling behind. There was cost escalations and that the communication was poor. We can't put blame to anyone, but the result of it was that there wasn't really a good discussion and an attempt to try and mitigate it. It just escalated and escalated. We had a situation then that the EPC PLTC contractor informed MDOT that it needed $187 million and an extra 5 months just to complete the first phase on the east phase. And this is where negotiations broke down. And then PLTC started to exercise its right to leave the project and said it was going to vacate the project in 60 to 90 days as it was allowed to, and in an orderly transition. And that meant, you know, shutting down the infrastructure, securing it so that when they looked for a new construction consortium, that the project was not going to be in danger or be any danger to people. What was interesting is that this also led to major challenges between the EPC contractor and the investors, because suddenly the investors were still up. They had invested in the project and were committed, and they had to scramble to find a new EPC contractor. So people started saying, let's stop throwing money at the project. There were 3 scenarios that were indicated that could happen. You know, the state would take over the project and become the operator, finding a new private partner who could take over the project, or reaching agreement with the existing company. And no matter what the scenario was, it was going to cost the government extra money and unbudgeted money at that. And the question then started being asked by politicians, stakeholders, and a very vocal community. This was in the news almost every day in the newspaper, on television for months. You know, why throw more money at a project that wasn't going anywhere? The consequence was that negotiations even broke down even more, and the state did not agree with the contractor's assessment of the extra costs that they said when 2022 was the first phase completion date. This was not going to happen. The contractor stepped away and the project stalled, and the construction sites had to be secured at great cost because they were a great risk to the community around it. So the question we have to ask is, you know, what could have been done better? It was, should we have accepted a low cost bid? Environmental effects, should they have even launched the project until the environmental concerns were fully addressed, because that slowed down the project? I think better stakeholder consultation would have helped alleviate tensions. Early solutions seeking, partner trust building, better conflict resolution protocols would have been better. It seemed everyone was doing the ostrich effect of sticking their head in the sand and hoping that things wouldn't happen and move away. I think the MDOT and MTA should may have been more assertive in monitoring the project. The consortium members should have also formed a more cohesive team, and project risks should have been more astutely allocated. What is the postscript? So here we are in September 2021. They are now looking for a whole new EPC construction group. So it's being rebidded and retendered. There's going to be a selection of a new contractor for the Purple Line project. They hope by the end of this year to have made a new selection, and then only in February 2022 will they then select the contractor to carry on with the construction. Again, an epic fail, because the project phase 1 was supposed to end in 2022, not actually almost being restarted. A new timeline is going to have to be determined, and I think this is going to be problematic because the stakeholders have different ideas on the timeline. New cost estimates will have to be introduced. And basically, the project, which has been in limbo since 2020, September, is now going to have to be kickstarted. There are also $700 million in unpaid overruns. And the new schedule must be approved by the State of Public Works. So another stakeholder. So there were numerous stakeholders that were involved. You know, we had the community, we had the EPC contractor, we had the investor, we had the county governments, we had the state government, we had the transit authority, we had the Department of Transportation, the public, the Board of Public Works, etc. And I can only hope that, you know, they will set up a better stakeholder communication plan and a stakeholder engagement plan. I'm hoping, you know, Danilo, that they take a look at the handbook and actually use some of the suggestions you make. This is a golden opportunity for them to really work on it. And, you know, still the environmental concerns have to be addressed, and it'll be interesting to see what happens over time. But everyone in DC is holding their breath. The challenge, some of the bad outcomes, one, it's given PPPs a black eye in this region. The big companies that were involved have also been given black eyes, and they have been spitting on other projects that are being considered as PPPs. The other big challenge that I think needs to be avoided, and hopefully it can be done, that the PPPs have become very politicized. And then we have now stakeholder groups, you know, end users, communities, etc., who might be diametrically opposed to the project and might be in conflict with one another. So just a practical, maybe a little unorthodox approach to this, but a very practical approach, a discussion of a real life project. If you want to read the great details, you can always go to my LinkedIn site, and I wrote a very detailed report on it. And that is just, you know, closing comments, you know, involve stakeholders. They are participants. Understand the differences between the different groups. Allow everyone to have a voice. Avoid legal challenges. That escalation is not a win-win situation for anyone, and enhance communication at all times. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David, for a very interesting presentation, and I hope that everyone enjoyed. I would like now actually just to check if anyone had any specific questions, and to say that if you can please send them in the chat, or just raise your hand using the reaction button in the bottom of your screen. Just to say that I'm uploading actually now both presentations on Google Drive, so that should be coming your way in a few minutes, if you also want to check that. So just to start discussions, I would like actually to make some interaction between both of the speakers. So perhaps Jean-Christophe, without wanting to put you on the spot here right now.
No, not at all. I'm very happy. I'm very happy to speak after this beautiful illustration of what actually can happen. I mean, I speak from experience. These massive delays create difficult tensions. I mean, imagine you have 700 full-time employees working as dedicated project resources, and this is just the private sector side. They have families. They have to travel to different sites to be able to execute these projects. They may not all be from the Maryland region. And then look at the government administration, the promises that were made to the beneficiaries of that infrastructure. They're suffering on a day-to-day basis because the travel time is over 1 hour just to get 10 kilometers or 10 miles further. those are actual difficulties, and it's very sad, but these blockages happen over and over. The United States is not the only state where that is happening. It's happened at Berlin Airport, it's happened at the Stuttgart train project, massive multi-billion projects, and still sometimes we're not getting it right. It seems that only the Swiss and the Chinese get it right, for very different reasons, though, I think.
Thank you for that addition, Jean-Christophe. And I actually like talking about this topic. I see that America sent a very interesting question in the chat about how to engage different voices from different stakeholders in the PPPs. So perhaps America, would you like to unmute yourself and ask that question directly to David?
Yes, and David, that you mentioned, well, thank you very much for your presentation, very interesting. And one of the points that you mentioned, that we shouldn't leave any voices out, which I agree. From my experience, this is a very important point. I even have to learn, I did a course of social network to learn which people is more influenced, and so we should invite them. How is your experience? How have you managed this to really try to include everybody, not leaving anybody out of the communication? Thank you.
So thank you very much. I didn't work directly on this project. I was actually working with the engineering company at the time when the project was being visualized. And already right at the beginning there, you know, there were town hall meetings, as we call them in the United States, where people were invited to come and see the conceptual drawings and the conceptual designs. Unfortunately, many of the areas that the project was going through were quite well-to-do areas and very established neighborhoods. And so as soon as people started seeing that, you know, their streets were going to be torn up, their quaint little communities and little business areas were going to be disturbed, etc., people started getting alarmed. I know that numerous attempts were made in working with the different stakeholders and adjusting the alignments and that, however, because of the commitment to keep with existing right-of-ways and that, there was a challenge that, you know, it was going to go through those neighborhoods whether people felt comfortable about it or not. And I think, you know, that the opportunities were, you know, one of the biggest opportunities was lost, I suppose, was right up front, that I firmly believe that the environmental concerns, you know, many people might have felt were not that big because they were little streams and things like that. You know, maybe that was a bit of the attitude of the public sector. Well, this is not a major stream, you know, or, you know, it's, you know, they were states that I think there was a critically endangered little frog that lived there, you know, people belittled some of these comments and that. So, you know, the breakdown occurred, and for some reason it just escalated and escalated. So, you know, I think it's important when a public entity starts a project right at the beginning, where I was slightly tangentially involved, is that you need to listen. If you don't have the experts who can communicate the messages, if they can't, you know, articulate what's being said, if they can't address it, then you really need to, you know, engage people who can help with the communication, because this has to be done from the beginning. Because this is almost like, I think there's an expression, a death by 1,000 little, you know, pricks, or 1,000 little slices. You know, it just got worse and worse and worse. And, you know, basically in the end it was, you know, those 1,000 little cuts led to a bloodbath. So, you know, I would stress over and over again, you know, you can never communicate enough, but it's also important, and I think this is really important, to engage the stakeholders and understand that they can express their expectations, their concerns, but that they are not running the project as such when it comes to the PPP agreement, because the PPP agreement is a contractual agreement between the public and the private sector partners. And sometimes, you know, expectations can be created that leads to these challenges. I once was invited to an Army Corps of Engineers, US Army Corps of Engineers meeting. This is pretty much like the Rijkswaterstaat in the Netherlands. And it was, they invited all, they invited not stakeholders, but they invited partners. And what they meant by the term was actually stakeholders. So immediately all parties felt that they were legitimized, that they could comment on absolutely everything. And this spooked the investors because, and the developers, because they would say, who's actually going to run the project? Who's going to set the expectations? We can't have new stakeholder groups that appear 3 years into the project, 4 years into the project, and start objecting and then, trying to change the contractual obligations and that. So it's a fine art. It's a fine balance. It's something that you have to work with. And I see this in all countries. In the United States, stakeholder groups are very vocal. They have the mechanisms, the means, the forums to do that. But in emerging economies, often these stakeholders don't. And in that case, I think the public sector has to make a concerted effort to reach out to communities that don't have a voice or are not aware of the projects. There's nothing worse for a community in an emerging economy to suddenly find out that they are going to be evicted and their property is going to be taken over, and that there's a road going right through their neighborhood, which is supposed to benefit them, but it benefits other communities. So a very long answer, America, to your question, but I hope that at least helped a bit.
Thank you, David. And talking about giving voices, I would like to actually open the floor to the open discussions with both speakers. And now, Omar, thank you for your patience. I would like to give the floor to you so you could ask the question to Jean-Christophe that you posed a bit earlier.
Please all put on your video so we can see you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Actually, this question might
I think the sound is a bit low. Excuse me, Omar.
Sorry.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah. No, thank you. And thank you both for the wonderful presentations, really insightful. And my question, I think, is actually may be appropriate to the both of you. It's regarding special purpose vehicles and its relation to PPPs. It's something that I've seen in the region being used, especially when sometimes they want to detach a particular project organizationally from the public entity. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts about it, when to use it, where to use it, and why.
Maybe I'll jump in. One thing that I always want to stress, which is important with a special purpose vehicle, another term that is used, it's called a project company. And this should be very specifically set up for that project. It should not include multiple projects. And the special purpose vehicle is an entity that's created specifically by private sector contractors and investors to be the legal entity that represents the project. So, for example, if it's, let's make it up, it's the Kuwaiti Port Authority, port project, for example, then the project company most probably would have that name, the Kuwaiti Port Project Company. And it's important that it's a legal entity which has its commitments and is, again, not to be confused again with a stakeholder organization, but it's a partner organization. But it needs to listen in a way to end users, because if you build a project that no one wants to use, then, you are going to have a SPV company that is going to, most probably not survive. And then the poor public sector is going to be saddled with a project that no one wants, no one uses, too expensive, etc. JC, I'm sure you have some comments as well.
Yes, you're fully right. I was wanting to react to the question of, is it the contract design that leads to most disputes, or are there other reasons? And I just looked at another slide deck, if I may share that, that I did this morning before I came here, which was on, you're going to be interested in this. Look, so everybody knows Barth already, but I need to push this a bit to show the whole slide deck. Presentation here. But actually, when we look at the conditions and why these conflicts happen, we need to dig in a little bit more. There's an association called the International Association of Contract and Commercial Management, called IACCM. that has run an analysis on what are the 70% of most frequently negotiated contract clauses, and most are protective. Because why do we do it in writing? Well, this is a slide earlier. That's because we wanted for evidentiary purposes to protect and safeguard our position. And so usually lawyers tend to publish a lot to avoid to perish, but it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I can say it as a lawyer, it's not always the best thing to write and design a contract for other lawyers. And so looking at this, and this is part of the answer that you were asking, why do we always have dispute? Is it because of poor contract design? Partially, yes. Because if you look at it, the orange clauses here, the orange points, limitation of liability, damages, intellectual property rights, confidentiality assurances, etc. Those are issues that come up in every shape and color in every contract. And those are most of the disputed clauses. And so what can we do about that? Well, we can structure differently. We can apply different language, different design. And I talked to you about UX design, but then you can also visualize things this way in saying, okay, well, I ask these questions: who, what, how much, where, when, how, and why. And I try to visualize that, one in the contract, but also in the process of finding out what the other party wants. And that leads to then better contracts overall. Okay, so this was a short excursion.
And I think, thank you for that, Jean-Christophe. And I think that links quite well with the question that Anna answered or put in the chat. But perhaps, Anna, if you would like to add something to your question or to ask something else also to David or Jean-Christophe, please.
Thank you very much for the explanation. My question was also caused by the fact that I've read a study about Latin America and the cases of renegotiation of concessions there. And there many of the contracts were caused exactly by contract, poor prepared contract. That's why I asked this. And I would like also to make some comment that, for example, in Ukraine, the role of communication strategies in the process of project design and implementation is underestimated. And we have such a problem that the population and many users, they don't understand what the PPP is. And most of them think that it's a kind of privatization. And the private partner gets an asset and his only aim is to receive profit, but we need to explain what are the environmental consequences and what the project will bring to the population, and we could change their relation to the project this way. That's what I wanted to add.
Thank you, Anna. I think you make a very, very important point that needs to be emphasized. PPP advocacy needs to be pushed. Like at WAPPP, we stand for a new generation of public-private partnerships. We want them to be next level. We want them to be more sustainable and to achieve superior results. But there is not much backing for that yet because it's simply not known. So we need to spread the message about that. And I agree with you that crisis communication in such projects is completely underestimated. There are very good consultants who do that, who earn a lot of money doing this for these massive projects. I mean, all the Stuttgart 21 failings, the Berlin-Schöneberg failing, I'm sure for the Maryland project, they have all hired strategic communication advisors for this crisis communication exercise to contain the reputational harm. And they only are able to catch in that the message if they start doing joint communications together. And that takes re-establishing some form of trust and relationship. And for that process, it's very useful to break down and slow down, especially the communication effort, so that the parties are able to reconcile to, and here it's like the mediative dimension that becomes so important for the people to understand, to reframe what they have understood and slow down so that they're able to reconstruct a shared agenda. I think it's a discipline where we can all expand our knowledge. I can only encourage you to, start getting a bit of sensibilization in the area of mediative facilitation, because it's extremely useful for whatever you will be doing in terms of communication. Yeah, and involving external, say, decision takers on your behalf, you never get the result that you want. And I'm talking here at arbitration, like if you nominate arbitrators or a judge, I mean, by law, a judge needs to be independent, but is he or she always the best informed in infrastructure projects long-term? Sometimes, yes, but they may also have a political opinion about these things. And like a mediator will only help the parties to find a solution in that interest-based negotiation. The mediator doesn't have the role to decide anything. That's the role of the parties themselves. And that's why I believe, and having been for a long time in the arbitration industry, I have completely shifted to commercial arbitration because I'm convinced that it produces superior results that are closer to the needs of the parties. Is it easy? No, it's not. But I think it's the right way to go.
Thank you very much, Jean-Christophe. David, I noticed that Jean-Christophe's answer is kind of a bit of what you have asked, but perhaps you wanted to add something else?
So, in the sense of, I've worked in countries, where part of the big dispute resolution discussion is which court will decide, and who does the final dispute resolution go to? And, because there's concerns about bias of national courts when it comes to national projects versus international, agreements with international partners and that. Can you maybe elaborate on just some of the dangers that can occur, because to me, when you're sitting in front of a judge, that's the action of last resort. And, what the judge decides is then made. Can you elaborate a bit on that?
Yes, I mean, the judge has a limited role by design because he wants to shut out all emotions. But here are humans that are building infrastructure for other humans. And especially the people, mandated to defend the claims, they're all trained as lawyers or with a legal, specialization. And they are also trained to try to hold down emotions so that we stay as objective as possible. But reality is that conflict is something completely normal, and we need to prepare for that. And the better prepared for that, and that's the big paradox, the less likely it is we will run into huge disputes. But now, and that's a very important point you're making, David. Thank you very much for the perch. When we face a judge and that dispute about, on what venue to go to, there's again that huge disagreement potential on finding a neutral space for both sides. Because say you have a private party that is not from the same country as the public sector authority, they have to agree to something that is very uncomfortable for them. Another law, a venue in another country, maybe even another language, if they're not from the same country. And so it's never good to compromise because you don't feel comfortable. So what usually happens is they agree on an arbitration clause with like ICC, like International Chamber of Commerce arbitration, or with, if it's investment disputes between states and a private sector, it's ICSID tribunals at the World Bank. There's a special entity for ICSID disputes. Then between states, it's between like the World Trade Organization. They have these panels that are completely currently not working because there's no agreement on how to shape that. But de facto, and having experienced it myself, setting up the procedures, the rules of procedure for an arbitral tribunal is something that can take a long time. And I'm talking about many months. because first you need to, for every side, determine an arbitrator on your behalf. They then determine the president of the arbitral tribunal, and then only do they come up with procedural laws for that arbitration at stake, which they need to decide if they want to have it fast-tracked, how many witness testimonies. I mean, this is a complex private tribunal. And the dispute about the venue is essential. This is something you can agree on pretty much at the beginning during the honeymoon period of the contract negotiation, because that's easier to agree on things in that phase. But everybody who has experience knows that at some point we will inevitably run into issues that may become problems that then may escalate with hardening positions and become a full-blown dispute. And what you want to hope then is that they have prepared themselves, that they have laid down an escalation path and methods that enable them to find good alternative dispute resolution solutions. I myself am a big fan of mediation, and if both sides have difficulties to agree on one mediator, they can take a co-mediation. Every side chooses a mediator, and together they co-mediate the process. Yeah. You can do it online nowadays. There are possibilities, and the big advantage there is it's agile, it's very cost-effective, and it's confidential between the parties. They don't need to report on anything like it's the case if they go to a public court. So nobody risks losing face, and you can come up to self-determined outcomes, which are usually superior to any decision that has been taken on your behalf.
Thank you for that, Jean-Christophe, for that clarification. I think it was very insightful, and I see that there are some positive reactions to it in the chat as well. I saw that Charity raised her hand, so just before wrapping up the session, I would like just to confirm if Charity would like to unmute and ask your question. If you can be very brief, please, as well as Jean-Christophe or David in the answer. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Danilo. It's not even a question. I think I just wanted to commend and appreciate this particular topic, and especially the presentation, because then from a young developing nation like Namibia, we have only 4 or 5 years experience in PPPs. And I think these learnings and experiences that have been shared today have shed some light for me, and it's something that we're going to share. And looking at Namibia, we have not yet at this point signed a PPP agreement as of yet. So I think learning as to what to actually look out for beforehand and what to do if this emanates or that comes up, this is great learnings for us, and I really just appreciate it. And I mean, looking at how we do capacity building within Namibia, and I generally am responsible for capacity building trainings that we offer. These are some of the information that we share with candidates, and just learning that actually developed countries and countries that have experience in PPPs still actually go through some experiences and challenges that we talk about at this level, at the lower level as a developing nation, is something that is good to know and understand and learn from it. So thank you very much for all that was shared today.
Thank you very much for this kind message, Charity. And I think that actually it's a good way to wrap the session by actually encouraging everyone. If you have any materials, recommendations, or experiences that you want to share, please do send that to us, including Jean-Christophe and David. And we can include in the Drive folder, so we can also use this group as a way of like really sharing experiences, sharing like best practices, so we can work together to integrate resilience into PPPs. And now I think you know the procedure already. I would like to ask everyone to turn on their cameras so we can just have a quick picture to register this moment, and then we can wrap up the session. So I would just give a minute so everyone can turn on the cameras, and then if Max, you can please coordinate the picture.
I wanted to say, if you look at the slide decks, you will find more information on WAPPP with how to contact me if you have further questions. So feel free to reach out.
Thank you, Jean-Christophe.